I make 57 years old this year. And for 40 years of that 57, I had a drug addiction. I started using drugs at a very young age. I was 9 years old when I smoked my first joint and drank a bottle of wine. And that was what I found. I come from a separate family, and so I wasn't raised with a father. So that happened when I was around 7. So shortly thereafter, 2 years later, I guess to relieve my pain, pot was very common in the early 70s, the late 60s. And so, you know, smoking a joint and drinking a bottle of wine seemed to be just the end to my pain. Which shortly thereafter, by the time I was 20, cocaine came into the scene. And by the time I was 20, from using daily, from 9 years old up, I was using cocaine as well as selling marijuana and pretty much any other type of street drug that was available at the time. When I was 22, you know, when you're living that lifestyle with drugs, you hang with gunslingers and killers, I like to call them, from the streets. And I was shot twice due to my drug addiction. And in that time, I walked up the ladder to what I like to call them painkillers. A doctor prescribed me pain pills for the first time. And it was literally the end to my drug addiction, my pot addiction. Alcohol was always there. Alcohol is a common thing with addiction that, you know, it's kind of like water to the regular person. Liquor is very common in the drug world. So once I was introduced by a doctor, by what he thought was best to me, he gave me Vicodins and Loratabs. And the latter was so aggressive that 10 years later, I had started IV heroin use, which led to a 25-year of intravenous heroin addiction. In that time, I told you I was shot twice. I was hospitalized some 30 different times. I went to 30 different rehabs. I was literally dying, just fighting for my life. And I tried everything that I could do. I was even imprisoned. My freedom was taken away for 3 years of my life due to my drug addiction. And, you know, you think if someone took your, took your freedom away, it would change your mindset of what you do that got you there. And it did for about 8 months. I lasted. I actually accepted Christ in prison. That's where God came and found me, in a brick building locked behind a steel cage. You know, it was like the only place I could hear, you know. That's where you put animals that don't listen to anyone else. And at that time I was, you know, people don't call you Wild Will or the Wild Wildebeest or, you know, Wild Man or whatever else if you're don't fit in that category. So my prison time was actually one of the most profound times in my life, where I got to know who I was straight for the first time in my life. I went in when I was 30, came out when I was 33. And so from 9 to 30, you know, those, 21 years, I never knew who I was. I never had a straight mind. I did therapy and all in that time, and I was, had my therapist ask me one time, well, there had to be some days or holidays or something where you were straight, you know, where you remember that you didn't use. And I was like, no, positively not. Those were the days that we planned to use for a week straight before we took a rest, you know. So shortly after my prison time, I lasted 8 months. I went back in. I was doing prison ministry. And one day, straight from God's house, I drove right back in the hood and started using again. I backslid for 8.5 years. And I was literally dying. I just declare it as such a suffering, like something you can't imagine, for something to control you so death-defyingly, and you cannot stop it. Before I came and did this treatment myself, the last month I overdosed and I died 3 different times, and they revived me. And I didn't know, but maybe in my subconscious at that time, my father had died, someone that I thought I would one day get, you know, everything back in order before he did. And so I don't believe I was doing it consciously, but subconsciously, I did 5 years of Suboxone, as well as 5 years of methadone. And I just used them as a crutch along with my addiction to give me a couple of days of break, you know, in my sleep time to kind of, only thing it ever did for me was minimize the withdrawal state. And so after I started overdosing and dying, I was literally just made the conscious decision that that's what I was going to do, because I wouldn't take any other medicine to help myself, but yet I couldn't stop my heroin addiction. And had a little therapist friend of mine who is still one of my best friends to this day. And she kept saying, Mark, you have to try this new medicine. It's nutrition. And I'm like, I'm not using any drug to stabilize another drug again. And it took me 1.5 years to finally agree that I would do an NAD treatment. And it was August of 2010. And so it's going on 9 years now that I had my treatment, and I haven't had a repetitious thought or a craving or desire to ever use a drug or drink again. In that time, I owned 3 of the biggest clubs in New Orleans. And we know that in New Orleans, that's the heartbeat of the city, you know, the alcohol. And I actually gave away all the clubs and everything else that was implemented anything that would hurt anybody from that day forward, and to do what I do now with this coenzyme with NAD. So I had the treatment myself, going on 10 years now. And now I'm the owner and founder of Brain Restoration Wellness Center that administers the nutrition that we use today.